All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Jorson with Northeast Metro Climate Action. Welcome to our December outreach event. Northeast Metro Climate Action is a volunteer-run community organization. We have members in White Bear, North Oaks, North St. Paul, Vadnais Heights, Shoreview, and Arden Hills. Our mission is to raise awareness on the climate crisis by holding outreach events like this one. We've been doing these events for over 2 years now, and the last almost 3 years now. And the last year and a half, of course, has been on Zoom. We're hoping to be back in person someday. We'll see how that all goes, but it has been very successful going online, and thanks for joining us tonight. Another mission of ours is to communicate with our elected officials to promote climate action and policy around climate, with both our local representatives and state and national, obviously. We write letters to the editor to make sure our voices are heard. So tonight's event is, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Gretchen Hansen. Dr. Hansen is an assistant professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Hansen's research focuses on climate change and long-term trends in fish population.
Great. Okay, thank you for that introduction and for inviting me to speak to your group, and thanks for everyone for being here. I know we're in the middle of a unprecedented weather event, and so maybe the fact that it's on Zoom is maybe good. We can stay home and be safe, but it feels sort of appropriate to be talking to a climate action group while we have a tornado watch in December. So I'm not going to be talking about extreme weather events. I am going to be talking about climate change and freshwater fish and lakes, with a focus on Minnesota and kind of the Midwest Great Lakes region in general, which is the area that I do most of my work. I am an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota before I worked here. So I've been at the U for 3 years. Prior to, well, this is my 3rd year. Prior to working here, I was a research scientist at both Minnesota and Wisconsin departments of natural resources. So I have kind of a applied fisheries management view of a lot of the research that I do, of understanding what's going on, but then also what can we do about it? If we want to manage fisheries in this state or any state, how do we do that in a world that is changing in ways that might be somewhat out of our control? So I'm going to lay out kind of a little bit of the research on how do we understand what's going on with lakes, how do they respond to climate change, what happens to fish as a result of that. There's a lot of unknowns there, but I'll tell you a little bit, and then end with some examples of what we might do about it, and we being people as a whole, state management agencies, things like that. So I guess we'll just get started. So as I said, I work on lakes in the Midwest. This is the spatial footprint of a region that I work in a lot. It is a region that is a part of a federal fish habitat partnership known as the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, that brings together people and resources from across this region. So there's an 8-state region where I got involved when I was a research scientist working in Wisconsin DNR to start looking at questions that really don't stop at state boundaries and try to understand how are various stressors impacting fish habitat across the Midwest. And when I think about fish habitat, I know a lot of people, especially anglers, might think of like, oh, there's some wood in the water, or like spawning habitat and rocks, and that kind of thing is important. But I think of fish habitat often on a more broad spatial scale. So like, what's the water quality? What's the temperature? Is this lake suitable for fish to live in? And how can that influence our management of fisheries? So This is the area that I generally work. Lakes are obviously a really predominant part of this landscape, as you can see on this map. There are lots of them. There's more than 40,000 lakes in this region that are over about 10 acres in size. So trying to use approaches to understand what's going on in as many of those lakes as possible, and how do we manage that many lakes with limited resources. Whoops, somebody's unmuted. No, we're back. Okay. So lakes in this part of the country are important. As I showed on the map, they're a big part of the landscape. They're important to our economies, our recreation, our culture, and ecologically important as well. They provide a number of services, one of which is fisheries. So here's me on my birthday a couple years ago with a giant muskie. I didn't catch it on a hook and line though. That was when I was working for DNR, and we pulled it out of a net, but still the biggest muskie I ever got to hold. And so we value lakes for a lot of things in this part of the country. And so understanding what's going on with them is important. And I'm here to talk about climate change today. But it's kind of impossible to talk about climate change impacts on lakes and fisheries without thinking about other things that impact lakes as well. Because climate change is a threat multiplier. So we have other stressors that are impacting our lakes, like nutrient loading or invasive species. And climate change is a stressor in itself, and it also interacts with these other things in potentially important ways that can influence our management of these systems and influence their response. So I'll touch on a couple examples of that today. So one of the big themes of my research and the work that I do to try to understand how we can manage fisheries across the landscape of lakes is that lakes are variable. So we know that just lakes themselves, their characteristics are variable. Here in Minnesota, we see that really kind of predominantly. We have big lakes and small lakes and deep lakes and clear lakes and shallow lakes and turbid lakes. And it's true across the globe as well. And they also vary in their response to things like climate change. So there have been a number of global studies and more local studies showing that climate change is happening, temperature is increasing, lakes are getting warmer, but the rate at which they get warmer is really variable. And that's true on the global scale, but also true at a more local scale. So lakes don't respond the same way to the same climate necessarily. And understanding that variability is important for management of fisheries, because if lakes aren't changing in the same magnitude or direction, we shouldn't expect the fish that live within them to respond in the same way either. And therefore our management response might also have to be different. And I also talked about some of those other stressors that are impacting lakes, and those too are pretty variable across lakes. So we have invasive species that are in some lakes but not in others, and get to high abundances in some lakes but not others. And similarly with things like nutrient loading, the trends of water quality across this part of the lakes in this part of the world are really variable. So variability is a key part of what I'm going to talk a lot about today. Kind of a core theme to understand that these responses of lakes to climate change are variable, and so how we manage them is also variable and complicated. So the three kind of major parts of what I'm going to talk about today are, first, just looking at lake responses to climate change, understanding variability in lake responses in terms of lake temperature. Then looking at so what, why does it matter? How are fish themselves responding, fish populations responding to those changes in lakes? And then what now? What do we do in the face of climate change if we want to manage fisheries? So we'll start with lakes response to climate change. So just showed you this map. There are lots of lakes in this part of the world. And in order to understand and predict how fish might respond to climate change, it's important to understand how lake temperature is responding as the climate changes. And it's not as simple as just looking at air temperature, for which records are numerous. When I first started working on this, I said, okay, we shouldn't use air temperature because fish don't live in the air. Let's use water temperature to understand, in order to understand how fish are responding. But it turns out water temperature data from lakes over the kind of time series, the length of time that we might need to understand fish responses to climate change, those kinds of data are pretty rare. And so if we think about, there's 40,000 lakes in this part of the country that are over 10 acres. Only a couple hundred to maybe a couple thousand have, or sorry, I have this wrong. Only a couple hundred have temperature data observed on at least 100 days over the past 40 years. So we don't have a lot of lakes with long time series of data. If we were interested in lakes that had just a couple observations, we get a few more lakes, but it's still a really small percentage of what's out there. So we don't have a really good handle on how lakes are changing in terms of their temperature in response to climate change. And so I'm a part of a group that has spent quite a bit of time working on models to take air temperature data and wind data and local land cover data, and then information about lakes themselves in terms of how big they are and how clear they are, to then put all that together and say, okay, how do we think lakes, can we recreate the historical response of lakes to climate change and weather conditions, and can we also forecast that into the future? So we've done quite a bit of work on this, on simulating water temperatures across tens of thousands of lakes in this region in order to kind of capture that variability of how lakes respond to climate. And so I'm not going to go into the details of that sort of like nerding out modeling situation, but it has been a big part of the research that I've done on fish responses to climate change in order to kind of analyze these data and understand what's going on across a broad landscape of lakes. So one thing that we work a lot on in these modeling efforts is trying to take information on lake temperature and translate that into something that is meaningful, both for people to understand and meaningful in terms of how do we think fish are actually experiencing lake temperature and responding to it. And so there's no kind of single observation of lake temperature over the course of a year that we might think fish that would influence fish. And we also have a situation in a lot of our lakes that temperatures are really variable from the surface to the bottom waters. So lakes that are relatively deep stratify in the summer, where there's warm waters in the surface of the lake, and those warm waters are cut off from bottom waters, which tend to be really cold. And that's going to come up later in the talk when we think about cold water fish responses to climate. But taking information on lake temperature and translating it into something that's meaningful is not a trivial task. So we have millions of observations of lake temperature that we've generated from our models. What do we do with that information? So one thing we can do is just look at trends in either, say, surface temperatures of lakes or bottom temperatures of lakes. And so that's what's shown in the map here, just for Minnesota. And a couple things that pop out when we do that kind of summary. First of all, most lakes are getting warmer since these data are from 1980 through present day. So during that time period, the vast majority of lakes are getting warmer in their surface waters. That's what's shown in this little histogram here. So anything that is above the 0 line means it's getting warmer. So lots of observations where lakes are getting warmer, but some of them are not. Some of them are getting colder. So that's kind of noteworthy and interesting. And you can see that on the map too. The colors, the like kind of dark purple are lakes that are getting colder, and the lighter yellows are lakes that are getting the most warmer. And again, we see like a lot of variability across the state, and even lakes that are right next to each other might be experiencing really different trends in their temperature. When we look at bottom temperatures of lakes, it's even more variable. So here we have an almost equal split between lakes that are getting warmer and lakes that are getting colder. And that's because lakes that stratify, so where the cold bottom waters are kind of cut off from the warm top waters, we see some places where that stratification happens earlier in the year. Those bottom waters are cut off for a longer period of time. They might not have a chance to be exposed to air temperatures that might warm them up. So we get more places that are getting colder, but still other places that are getting warmer. So the point here is there's a lot of variability both across the state in how lakes are responding in terms of their temperature to climate, and variability just within a single lake between what's happening in the surface and what's happening in the bottom. And if you're a fish, those differences are really relevant and might impact how you respond if you live in the surface waters versus if you live in the bottom waters. So we want to quantify those differences. Another interesting area of variability is that we see really different trends in seasonal temperature change across Minnesota. And so if this graph here shows averaged by month, the kind of average temperature change across all lakes in the state for both the surface and the bottom waters. There's a couple different lines here that you don't have to pay too much attention to. The major point here is that the rate of warming, and even if lakes are warming at all on average, really varies by seasons. And what we see is that the highest rate of warming is happening in the fall. And in winter and spring, we see kind of no trend or sometimes even cooling trends in lake temperatures. And so these seasonal differences are important for a number of reasons ecologically. One way that they're important as it relates to fish is thinking about spawning temperatures and when fish are going to spawn. And so we have, in Minnesota, we are blessed with all kinds of fish species that have all kinds of life histories and thermal preferences. But we can group them into thermal guilds, so species that prefer warm water, cold water, or cool water. And oftentimes those preferences correspond with when a fish species spawns. So walleye are a spring spawner. And when we look at the timing of when lakes are reaching the preferred temperature for spawning for walleye, we see that it's happening overall on average about 3 days earlier in this time period. In contrast, we have bluegill, who are a representative of a warm water species that spawns in the summer. Their spawning is happening about 2.5 days later as a result of these temperature changes. And then the biggest change is in our cold water fish, who are fall spawners generally, and those fish are reaching their preferred temperatures for spawning almost 5 days later. So those numbers might sound kind of small. You know, it's just a couple days. And we haven't gone deep into this analysis yet. We're just looking at temperatures at this point. But small changes in the timing of things like spawning can have really big impacts on populations if the timing of spawning and hatching of young fish doesn't line up with the timing of, say, their prey resources that they need soon after they hatch. And so seeing changes of this magnitude is concerning because we might worry about the capacity of these fish to find the prey they need when they hatch. So that's sort of a lead in to what do we know about, so that was all kind of like theoretical of how fish might respond to these changes in temperature. What do we know when we actually look at fish populations across the state and how they're responding to climate change? Oops, there we go. So temperature is known as a master factor in ecology. It impacts almost everything about lakes and the things that go on in lakes, and almost everything about fish, their growth, their survival, their reproduction, as well as the prey that they eat and the nutrients of the lakes that they live in, just kind of everything. And so as a result, it can be difficult to predict exactly how fish will respond to changes in temperature, because those changes in temperature are influencing fish habitat. So we might assign fish to these thermal guilds that I talked about, and we can ask questions about how much of a lake or how many lakes are meeting the temperature requirements of different fish species. But we also know that temperature can influence the feeding and the metabolism and the growth and the spawning timing and all kinds of other things about fish, and that is happening to the whole community. And so understanding the response of one fish species might require knowing what's going on with another fish species. So it can be difficult to predict exactly how fish are going to respond to changes in temperature because of all these interactions and indirect effects. And so when we dive in and ask questions about what is the relationship between fish species that we might care about, say as anglers or fish managers in a state, We find some trends and a lot of variability, and a lot of potential indirect effects that we don't understand. So one example comes from Wisconsin and some work I did when I was there, where we looked at how populations of both walleye and largemouth bass were related to lake temperature. And here we used degree days as our measure of lake temperature. This is a cumulative measure of temperature over the course of the growing season. So higher degree days means lakes are warmer, lower degree days means lakes are cooler. And when we looked at these two species, both of which are managed in Wisconsin lakes, but maybe preferred to different degrees by different people, we found that, probably not surprisingly, walleye, which are cool water fish, were more likely to naturally reproduce and survive in lakes that were cooler, and less likely to do so in lakes that were warmer. So that kind of makes sense because I just told you they are cool water fish. And similarly, kind of makes sense that largemouth bass, which are a warm water fish, we found to be much more abundant in lakes that were warmer than lakes that were cooler. So like, okay, that's obvious. I just based on their thermal preferences, right? But what we didn't expect to find, but did find, was that, first of all, the response of these fish to changes in temperature was really non-linear. So it wasn't just as lakes got warmer, you got consistently fewer walleye and consistently more bass. Instead, there was this strong kind of threshold response, that like things were fine until you reached a certain point, and then the probability of a lake supporting walleye really dropped off, and that the threshold for supporting large abundances of largemouth bass was at about the same place. So there was this real inflection point between walleye dominance and largemouth bass dominance that was related to temperature. So we use that information in a number of different ways. One thing that we could do is take those relationships we identified and take some future climate projections of how lake temperatures were going to respond to future climate change under various scenarios, and predict which lakes and how many lakes were likely to support which fish species. And so when we did that in Wisconsin, during kind of a contemporary period, we started out with this proportion. So we had, a couple thousand lakes that we were working with, that we had the data that we could do this for. Most of them were dominated by bass. That's because bass like small lakes, and most lakes on the landscape are small. And then we had a few lakes where they could coexist, and then several lakes where walleye were dominant, and then lots of lakes where no fish, neither one was supported. When we project that out into the future, it looks like it's getting cut off a little bit. When we project that out into the future, what we see is, probably not surprisingly, given what I just told you, that warmer conditions lead to more bass and fewer walleye. We saw a lot more lakes being bass dominant, a lot fewer lakes being walleye dominant, although it appears to be cut off so you can't see it. And bass kind of really being able to expand quite a bit across the landscape in Wisconsin. So a couple caveats, because I've told you the theme of my life and research is variability, and not all lakes respond in the same way. One thing that we noted from this work is that the effective temperature on both of these fish species really varied across lakes and was strongest in small lakes. So if we looked at bigger lakes, we didn't see as strong of a temperature effect for either walleye or for bass. We saw generally those big lakes were really fairly likely to continue to support walleye even as they got warm. And that the real drop in supporting walleye happened primarily in small lakes. And the opposite was true for largemouth bass. The temperature effect, where we expect the most largemouth bass, was in small lakes as they got warmer. And that warming effect was minimal in small lakes. And so that kind of implies, and what we understand from a lot of the other work that we did, that this temperature effect is not necessarily a direct physiological effect on the fish. So it's not like lakes are too hot for walleye to live in, or when they get warm, or too cold for bass to live in when they're a little bit cooler. That there are other interactions going on, and kind of indirect effects, as we call them. So maybe species interactions or competition happening that are related to temperature, but not a direct effect of temperature, because we see walleye reproduction and survival really decline in these lakes well before they get too hot for walleye to survive physiologically. And so that has led to a lot of other research to really try to understand that mechanism. What is it about lakes as they get warmer that make them less hospitable for walleye? We don't necessarily know the answer to that, but we're working on it. Another interesting thing that happened when I came to Minnesota and started working on walleye here is that we found the exact opposite effect of temperature on the probability of walleye reproducing and surviving in Minnesota's largest walleye lakes. So this map shows the ones I'm talking about here, like the really big walleye lakes, Mille Lacs, Leech, Red, Cass, etc. So I came from Wisconsin, and this is a good reminder that we should always be open to learning from new data and not get too entrenched in our beliefs. So I came from Wisconsin with this idea of like, yeah, we've got these cool methods to look at what's going on with walleye reproduction and survival. It's related to temperature, it's related to degree days. Let's do a similar analysis on these Minnesota lakes and it'll all be good. And what we found was the opposite effect. So in these lakes in Minnesota, we saw that as temperatures got warmer, as degree days got higher, we saw higher probability of walleye reproducing and surviving. And it was the really cold years that were worst for walleye reproduction and survival. And so this shows that same degree day metric that is the opposite shape of what we saw for walleye in Wisconsin. And we also saw a relationship with winter severity, where again, really severe winters, so really cold winters are not so good for walleye reproduction. Warmer winters are better. So this is the total opposite of what I thought from my work in Wisconsin. And I think is related to probably two things. One, the range of temperatures that we're looking at is different in kind of northern Minnesota lakes versus middle Wisconsin lakes. It is colder here in Minnesota than in that part of Wisconsin. And so we just might not have observed the high enough temperatures in Minnesota so far to start to see that kind of like declining effective temperature. And in Wisconsin, we saw that the temperature effect was strongest in small lakes and not so strong in big lakes. And this was only looking at big lakes. And so it kind of further emphasized that result that big lakes seem to be a little bit more resilient to these changes in temperature. And that's something to think about and work on as we move forward. Okay, I'm gonna have to speed it up because I see the time is going by. Okay, so another thing I want to point out about understanding fish responses to climate change is that, as I mentioned before, there are other drivers that are important in determining fish habitat and fish responses, and climate can interact with those other environmental drivers to determine fish habitat and fish responses. So one area that people in my lab, my students and postdocs and I are working a lot on is water clarity. And so water clarity can be influenced by land use and nutrient loading. It can also just be influenced by the position of a lake in the state. There are certain parts of the state where water is really stained, and so that water is going to be not very clear no matter what happens with land use. And it can also be influenced by climate because precipitation can either wash a bunch of nutrients in and make lakes less clear, or under drought conditions can make lakes more clear. And what we know particularly about walleye is that they have preferences in terms of the level of clarity that they prefer. They have specialized eye structures that make them better feeders. They can find their food better in relatively dark and turbid water. And so when we think about walleye responses to temperature change, what we really try to think about is how that temperature change interacts with and overlaps with what's going on with the light conditions and the water clarity. And what walleye really like is a place in the lake that has their best light conditions and their best thermal conditions. We call that thermal optical habitat. And so we want an overlap of those things. And so understanding how temperature and clarity are changing can provide some insights into what's going on with fish populations. So I've done some work on Mille Lacs, and understanding, anybody who's from Minnesota and is a walleye angler probably knows that walleye in Mille Lacs have declined over the past several decades by a fairly significant amount. And so we use this idea that maybe both temperature and water clarity are coming into play to influence walleye habitat. And we tested whether changes in those conditions could explain changes in the walleye populations in Mille Lacs. And we found that there was a relationship, particularly in this case with water clarity. So temperature didn't really explain what was going on with walleye. In this case, it was more the optical habitat. So changes in water clarity as the lake got clearer, it supported fewer walleye. And we were able to identify safe harvest levels. So how much of the walleye population could you safely remove without being unsustainable, and relate that to that habitat area over time. And so here we identified that you might be able to manage your harvest in a way that takes into account these changing conditions to avoid further declines of the population. And that really leads into the final part of this talk. How do we design fisheries management and kind of landscape management for adaptation and resilience to climate change? And there's a couple key themes of what I think we can do. So one of them is just generally manage expectations. As we see lakes changing as a result of climate change and other things, they are not necessarily going to be able to support the same fisheries that they were 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. And so understanding how conditions are changing and what that means for the fish community, I think is a good first step to adaptation to climate change, because we can't keep pouring resources into trying to support a fishery in a lake that is just not suitable for that species anymore. So this is from our work in Wisconsin, again, where we created this mapper where we could say, you know, under current conditions and future conditions, how likely is any given lake to support walleye or to support bass? And we tried to do this to help managers and people who lived on lakes and anglers and other stakeholders to say, you know, is my lake really suitable for walleye now, and will it be in the future? And if it's not, you know, what are nearby lakes that maybe I could go to that might be more suitable if I wanted to fish for walleye? Another thing that I work a lot on is something called adaptive management. So I mentioned that we see these relationships with temperature and fish species that we care about. We don't always understand exactly what is going on or why these relationships exist. We don't always understand the mechanism. And so if we don't understand the mechanism, it can be sometimes hard to identify the right management actions. If we don't know that, you know, warm lakes are not suitable for walleye reproduction because, is it because there's not enough prey? Is it because there's not enough, or they're competing with other species? Could we fix it by stocking? It's really hard to know if you don't know the mechanism. And so adaptive management is a tool that we can use when we have a landscape of lakes like we do in this part of the country, where we can use scientific methods to develop controlled experiments to say, okay, if we do one thing on one set of lakes and maybe another thing on another set of lakes, that's going to help us learn a lot faster than if we just do the same thing everywhere or kind of randomly do stuff just in response to what people are thinking we might do that year. And so setting up these more controlled management experiments can really help us to understand mechanism and to understand what is an appropriate management response to these conditions that maybe we've never even seen before. And this can be a really challenging thing to implement because nobody likes to be in the, well, usually people don't like to be in the reference group, the group of we're not going to do anything, even as the lake is changing potentially in a direction that we don't want it to go. And I liken this to, you know, placebos and like double-blind controls in medical research. Nobody really wants to be in the placebo group, but I think in that context, we recognize maybe a little better, we need that group in order to understand whether something actually works or doesn't work. And so we've tried a couple of these across the landscape to learn about management responses. And for example, whether stocking can reverse some of the negative impacts of climate change on walleye fisheries. And these take a long time to really play out. So this is a decades-long experiment that we're involved in now. But I can tell you, early data tell us that we are seeing walleye recruitment kind of rebound in lakes that we didn't stock and lakes that we did stock in this group of lakes in Wisconsin. And so I use that as a great example of why it's really important to have our reference lakes that we didn't stock, because if we had stocked everywhere, we would think stocking is the reason these lakes rebounded. But in fact, even the lakes that we didn't stock are rebounding. So let's try to understand why that is and what that means for future management. And then the thing I'm going to end on, I'm going to hopefully not go too much longer, but I want to give you a little bit of a case study of the idea of managing for resilience. And the idea that as climate change happens, or as anything happens that feels somewhat outside of the control of any given lake association or angler group or state management agency, things might be changing in a way that we don't really have the capacity to reverse. But things like climate change might interact with other variables that can be managed locally, for example, harvest. So this was the idea in the Mille Lacs example I showed, that as water in Mille Lacs has gotten clearer, that's happening as a result of a number of different changes on the landscape and invasive species. It might not really be manageable from a fisheries management agency perspective, but it does influence sustainable harvest, and we can manage harvest. And so there's this idea of the safe operating space, which basically means there is a set of conditions that produces something that people value. Let's say it's a walleye fishery. And there's another set of conditions that is not good outside the safe operating space. There's no walleye. And there are combinations of variables related to something like climate and something like harvest that produce either good outcomes or bad outcomes. And the idea here is that as the environment changes, so as climate changes, that might push a system outside of kind of the good place into the bad place. We might not be able to reverse that change, but we can sometimes, by managing something locally, shift the system back into the safe operating space or the good place. So we can't reverse this climate change, but we can change something else and maintain services that we care about. And so I'm going to give you an example of that related to Cisco or Tulaby, a cold water prey fish that's important in Minnesota and throughout the Midwest. And that has been declining in lakes throughout the Midwest. So Pete Jacobson is retired from Minnesota DNR, but has led most of this work for the past several decades. And I've been working with him for a little while to keep it going. So he was a part of and led up a group of people who went to all of the lakes in the upper Midwest that had historically had Cisco and documented where they were extirpated or continuing to have populations, or where they were maybe rare. And we see they're declining and have disappeared from a lot of lakes throughout the Midwest. And we know that Cisco are a cold water fish, so they need cold water. But there's this interesting interaction for Cisco between temperature and nutrient loading from the landscape. So I told you before, a lot of lakes, deeper lakes in this part of the world will stratify. So in the summer, there's warm water on the top and cold water on the bottom. So a species like Cisco that likes cold water can survive even in really hot summer conditions. You know, the surface waters of this lake could be 85 degrees. As long as there's cold water down at the bottom, they can hang out down there and be fine in terms of temperature. That only works if those waters continue to contain oxygen. So nutrient loading can produce algal blooms. As that material falls to the bottom and decays, that can reduce oxygen in the bottom waters of a lake and cause anoxic conditions and can cause fish kills. So if there's no oxygen down here, these Cisco can't survive. So we need a combination of cold water that has oxygen in order for a Cisco to persist. And so that means that both climate and land use affect Cisco habitat. And so Pete and others came up with this metric called TDO3. You don't really need to understand what that is. Just know that when TDO3 is low, and we'll call those tier 1 lakes, those are really good lakes for Cisco. They have lots of oxygen at low temperatures. It's really good. There's a set of conditions that are sort of marginal that we'll call tier 2, kind of in the middle. Cisco can survive, but it's like kind of on the tipping point. And then tier 3 would be places that TDO3 is actually, it's high, but that means habitat is low. These are not really suitable for Cisco. The temperatures are too high, the oxygen is too low. And so we know that cold water habitat is determined by both lake shape and then by watershed development and climate conditions. So we can use those relationships to, first of all, predict Cisco habitat across a landscape of lakes and say where are our really good, our tier 1 lakes, where are our kind of marginal lakes, and then where do we not expect Cisco to survive? That would be the tier 3. So we can do that under current conditions, And we can also say, how do we expect temperature to change across the landscape under climate change? And what is that going to do to that Cisco habitat across these lakes in the Midwest? And what we find when we do that is, probably not surprisingly, as temperature increases under climate change, we see a loss of these tier 1 lakes. So a lot fewer lakes that are optimal for Cisco, a loss of tier 2 lakes as well. So even places that are kind of marginal but still okay are declining, and then an increase in the tier 3 lakes. So more lakes that are just completely unsuitable for Cisco. And we can do that on a whole region basis. We can do that on a state by state basis to kind of help prioritize resources. And so this idea of resilience and the safe operating space comes in when we think about how do we manage for Cisco across this landscape, where here we have, temperature might be increasing and potentially creating unsuitable conditions for Cisco. But watershed development interacts with that, and we might have a little bit more control over what goes on in the watershed than we do over what goes on in the climate. And so we can look at lakes and say, how much temperature change can they absorb? How much watershed development can they absorb? What does that tell us about the resilience of lakes and the appropriate management response? And so that's what we did for these lakes in the Midwest. We estimated how much do we think Cisco habitat is going to change under future climate change. And so we could say, maybe a lake starts here, Cisco habitat is good, climate change is going to move it a certain degree this way, so temperature is going to warm. We might have some lakes that continue to be to have suitable Cisco habitat even as temperature warms. We call those refuge lakes. So they're able to handle that level of warming, continue to be solid habitat for cold water fish. So we call those, and then we can look at, well, what would happen if we even increased watershed development? Would we still have good Cisco habitat? Some of them, the answer is still yes. These are just really high quality lakes. We call these refuge lakes. They're resilient to watershed development. They're resilient to climate change. We should really focus on protecting Cisco in these lakes. On the other end of the spectrum, we might have lakes that are, as climate warms, we might predict that habitat's not going to be suitable anymore. The climate warming pushes them out into this unsuitable zone. And even if we changed watershed development, we wouldn't expect that habitat would get any better. The level of warming is too much. So we would call these limited potential lakes. They have limited potential for cold water fish, no matter what we do. Not a lot that can be done there. The more interesting stuff kind of comes in the middle, where watershed development plays a role and can flip lakes from suitable to unsuitable, depending on where you are. So we might have some lakes where we project the climate change, temperature increases, they're still going to be suitable, but only if we don't have any increase in watershed development. We would consider those to be a watershed protection need. So they're going to be resilient to the warming, but we can't let any more nutrient loading happen. We really need to protect those watersheds. We might have other lakes where climate change is projected to change the temperatures to a level that we don't think they're going to be suitable for Cisco anymore. But if we reduced watershed development, they might become suitable again. And we would call those a watershed restoration need, that we might actually be able to bring them back by restoring the watersheds. So we did this, we quantified this for thousands of lakes across the Midwest. And we're able to estimate that about 4,000 lakes in this part of the country fell into that middle ground where changes in watershed development could influence whether they were able to maintain Cisco or not. So we could estimate things like how much watershed development could increase and lakes would remain really high quality for cold water fish. We could estimate how much restoration might be needed to return a lake into that high quality status. We could also estimate for lakes that are kind of on the margin between completely unsuitable and sort of okay, how much can development increase and stay in that tier 2 range. And then for lakes that are in the unsuitable place, is there any amount of restoration that we could do to return them to tier 2? And so as scientists working on this, we can put these numbers out there, but how managers use this information and how we prioritize really depends on who you are and what the objectives of any given group are. And so we work with this Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership that allocates funds for restoration across this whole region. And so they might look at this broad landscape scale and say, you know, where are the lakes that we have the highest probability of conserving these cold water fish across the whole landscape? And we really want to focus on those. And we can make these maps and for individual lakes say, you know, what status are they, how much watershed restoration or protection might be needed to maintain cold water fish. But if you work in an individual state or an individual watershed, you might have a really different perspective. So Indiana has a few Cisco lakes left. Most of them are considered to be this limited potential. They're not likely to persist as the climate gets warmer, but there are a couple where they're predicted to be in that sort of marginal zone, like still probably pretty okay. Indiana is likely to really prioritize those tier 2 lakes versus Minnesota that has like quite a bigger distribution of high quality, medium quality, and limited potential cold water fish lakes. So the scale at which people are doing work really depends on how they're going to prioritize conservation across this landscape. And we can even do it on an individual lake scale. We can estimate what the cold water fish habitat is going to be under different levels of watershed disturbance and the uncertainty around that. And so these are individual lakes. And you can imagine kind of sliding these black dots around to say, well, if watershed development increases, are we likely to move out of good quality habitat kind of below this blue line into the marginal? Or, you know, if we reduced watershed development, say on this lake, could we get into the good quality habitat zone? And we can also do this in terms of just the probability of falling into the different habitat tiers. So like this lake, no matter what watershed development happens, is likely to be tier 1 versus some of these other lakes, we have some real thresholds. So we might want to protect watersheds more heavily in those places. So as many of you probably know, watershed conservation are ongoing in refuge lakes for Cisco throughout Minnesota, supported by the Clean Water, Land and Legacy Amendment, Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, and other kind of local watershed groups. And so this science that Pete Jacobson developed is already in action and already helping to protect watersheds of these vulnerable lakes. And we're spending a significant amount of money on it to protect the watersheds and protect the water quality. And this is where I think the real rubber hits the road in terms of how are we going to adapt to climate change. By conserving these watersheds, we are conserving cold water habitat for fish, but we're also protecting water quality that is valuable for all kinds of other reasons in lakes. So to me, it's really a win-win to protect this cold water habitat by protecting watersheds and water quality. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what me and people I work with and in my lab are doing to understand how climate change impacts lakes and the fish that live within them and how we might manage in that landscape of variability. My favorite phrase to describe what's going on is it's complicated and it depends. The effects of climate change vary across the landscape. Fish community responses are also variable, and appropriate management responses for adapting to and mitigating climate change are also variable. But we can come up with some rules and some ideas of where you might want to focus certain efforts in one place versus another in that landscape of variability. So it looks like I have time for questions. Thank you for coming. Here's my contact info for anybody who wants to follow up, and we can do questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hansen. That was really very informative. It's amazing the amount of lakes that we're talking about here that you're monitoring and assessing impacts of climate. And we're, as anglers, we're very thankful that you're doing that. So there are a number of questions in the chat that I'll just start with some of those. And Nikki, one of our core members, is very avid fisher person, and she's has a number of questions here. Do you foresee the possibility of Minnesota or Wisconsin changing fishing openers dates because of these? Has that been any bit of a discussion?
It's a good question. I have never talked to anybody about doing that. So I think so far the magnitude of change is not necessarily big enough that they might change the opener, because it's such a like tradition based thing. You know, the opener is about tradition as much as it is about ecology. But as we continue to see these changes in phenology, I think it would depend on the species of how much is the opener set relative to like protect spawners versus some other reason that we have the opener when it is. But it's a good question to think about and follow up on.
Yeah, I think a lot of mothers in Minnesota would be happy if Mother's Day wasn't the fishing opener. But
Yeah.
I had a question about your map with all the different. You said there's variability in the change of lake temperatures, and it to me it seems like, how can a lake be cooling while and I know there's variability, but really, are
Mhm.
there any theories on why some are actually cooling during this warming period?
Yeah, the main theory would be concurrent changes in water clarity.
Okay.
So it can be a little bit counterintuitive. So if lakes get clearer, as a whole, they will get warmer because the sunlight will penetrate deeper, but the surface waters will actually get cooler because it's not absorbing as much. And we've actually seen that happen in a lot of lakes, especially where zebra mussels have invaded, that their surface waters show a cooling trend as they get clearer.
All right, and speaking generally, do you see the potential for additional special regulations on lakes and or changes to bag limits due to climate change?
So I can't speak super intelligently about the process by which special regs and bag limits are implemented across the state. I can say that it is a process that involves both science and social
Yeah.
systems. That said, yes, I mean, I think special regs and changes to bag limits happen as we see changes in the populations of these fish. And so as we see the fish community change, whether it is known that it's because climate change or something else, I could see that impacting the reg.
And a question from Kate: are biologists looking at how the prey species of walleye and bass are being affected by climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about Cisco, so that's one kind of major prey species. And I'm involved in projects now where we're looking at the whole fish community. So when we did this before, we had a real focus on walleye and bass. And now we're trying to look at kind of all the fish that we can get data for. So we use a lot of data from state agencies of what they collect. But yeah, we're trying to look at concurrent changes. I didn't talk about it today because it's not done. So I don't have like much great news or anything to say about it, but we're looking at kind of whole fish community changes and how changes in one species might actually influence changes in another. And so because these species are dependent on each other and interacting with each other. So yes, we are especially in Minnesota interested in changes in yellow perch. So there's been a couple studies showing declines in yellow perch in the gear that the Minnesota DNR uses to assess them. But then questions of, are the populations declining, or are they actually just changing their life history and they're too small to get caught in the gear? And there's some evidence that that is true, that they're just maturing really early at a really small size and they're not getting caught in the gear, which is a known response of fish to climate change, to be smaller. So that's one example of something that's ongoing, is looking at perch. Are they changing in abundance, or are they changing in size and life history, both of which are really impactful for both the species that prey on them and for anglers who might be interested in catching yellow perch. You probably don't want to catch a 2-inch one.
Right. All right, here's another question. Has your research indicated any other changes in behavior beyond reproduction? And I think like biting on spinners versus spoons or something like that.
Yeah, so the water clarity work, we haven't researched this yet, although we do have a new project where we're going to implant like movement tags in fish to see what they do when the water gets too clear. But Anecdotally, from a lot of these lakes that have gotten clearer, that has negatively impacted walleye, we've seen anecdotal reports from anglers and guides and the fish biologists that like the night bite has become a much bigger thing. Like in Cass Lake, for instance, it's gotten way clearer because of zebra mussels. That the fish are changing their behavior. They're like hanging out and not eating so much during the day, but during the night is when they're active, when it's dark, and they like that. And that they're changing their behavior during the day in terms of like trying to find refuge from the light. So maybe they're like hunkering down under plant beds or kind of weird things like that. That's all anecdotal, but it's an interesting enough question because we don't understand the mechanisms necessarily of what's going on, like why they don't just keel over and die when it gets too warm or gets too clear. And so putting tags in them and following them around and understanding those behavior changes are certainly high on the list of things to figure out.
All right. Here's one from Tyler and asking about other than climate change, are we seeing other, do we feel that other areas such as agriculture runoff like glyphosate are playing a part in fisheries and natural waterways?
Yeah, so I haven't done research. I'm not really knowledgeable on like toxins, chemical toxins and what they're doing to fish. But certainly agricultural runoff in terms of phosphorus and nitrogen is a key part of any of this work. And so really the major drivers of what fish are where in the state are temperature and water quality as it relates to phosphorus and nutrient loading and water clarity. So, and the Cisco example where we're really kind of honing in on watershed land use as the lever through which we might be able to impact fish communities is related to runoff and agricultural runoff, for sure.
Right, and another question from Tyler regarding other effects like wakeboard boats, power boats, and other water toys on stocked lakes. Have you looked at that at all? Is that part of your research?
Yeah, I haven't. I've heard this come up in other groups too. I know it's kind of high on the list of questions that lake associations and people who spend time on lakes have. I have not looked into it, but I know there's some funded work happening to look at wakeboard boats, especially in the context of water level changes that might be due to, when we have high water levels due to higher precipitation or just like the management of a lake level, how things like wakeboard boats might be impacting things. But I think that's more focused on erosion and like spawning habitat that versus the stuff I'm doing.
All right. Yeah, I would think the churning of the big waves as well might have an effect as well. A question about your data on the tiers of the lakes. Is that public information? Is that on the DNR websites or is that not?
Yeah, so what I presented today was kind of an updated, version 2 of what has been done before led by Minnesota DNR scientists. So the earlier version is accessible. It is on the DNR website. And we're in the process of publishing and vetting this stuff. And so I'm happy to share it, but it's also going to be fully published, hopefully within the next couple of months.
Oh, okay. So it's not public yet, but it will be.
Yeah, and we've shared it, with people who are interested, but we have to do peer review, make sure everybody is cool with our methods and stuff.
And we'll do one more here. Thoughts on changing the state walleye limits or doing more focused limits on our higher stocking lakes? Has that been in any of the conversations?
So I'm reading the question and trying to understand it. Doing a 3 walleye limit on higher Cisco. So I have thought, oh, sorry, Tyler, are you going to come in?
Yeah, the question is on for lakes such as Mille Lacs, they have 1 walleye limit just based off of the last decade. Other bodies of water, Cass Lake, Leech Lake, Bemidji, we're looking at these where folks like to go out and fish actively. Do we need to maintain the same limits of 6 on those lakes that maybe we are stocking more or we have higher Cisco populations. I'm just wondering, because we kind of have that blanket limit of 6 walleyes, should it be more maybe lake by lake focused? I just a question, but curious.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to like talk out of school here, but obviously my focus of my research is on variability, right? And so a lot of what I do is like, you know, not every lake is different, but one size fits all doesn't work from a scientific point of view. That said, implementing, you know, bag limits or regulations of any kind, the more variable they get, the harder it is to justify or enforce or for people to understand. And so, like I said before, the process of establishing those, like science is a part of it for sure in the biology of the species, but possibly equally important is like, what are people going to follow? What's going to make sense? How can we communicate it? We don't want a regs book that's, you know, as big as the phone books of the olden days. And so making regulations more complex, while it might make sense from a like pure ecology point of view, doesn't necessarily make sense from a implementation point of view. There's trade-offs. So yeah, that's my hedging answer.
Well, all right. Well, thanks everyone online for your questions. They're very good questions, insightful. And Dr. Hansen, it was really a great talk. Very, very informative. I'd be surprised if many of us knew all the work that's going on the lakes and making sure that they'll be managed for future generations. And we're going to do our part as the climate activists to try to mitigate as much as we can the climate impacts and keep working towards that end as well. So
great. Yeah, that's the important work.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll have another in January, and we'll be talking to Dr. Christy Manning from McAllister about climate change and psychological impacts of climate change and how it's affecting our psychological and welfare. So join us again. You'll see more from our website and our Facebook page on that as we get closer.